So thanks for talking with me.
Sure.
I kind of wanted just to get this basic and about educating about the history of uranium in this place and making sure our viewers get a good history and understanding of what this whole scenario has really been about. So, when was the first time people started to mine uranium in Navajo Nation, and why did it continue?
Well, it started with the Manhattan Project. So I don't know if we have the first date of the actual first mine. I'm sure companies were already doing exploration, probably even in the late 30s, but definitely in the early 40s. So it was mostly for weapons. It was all for weapons. The World War II. Well, okay. For uranium mining, we can say that it started because of the Manhattan Project. But in reality, it actually goes back to the 1872 mining law. And then if you go even further back, I attribute it to the doctrine of discovery. So 1493, the doctrine of discovery basically says all these brown people in other parts of the world are less than human, and it's okay. In fact, it's God's will to go, civilize these savages and, kind of by any means possible. So, with the formation of the United States had what's called federal Indian periods. So, removal, which was basically extermination, and then relocation. So, these were actual policy periods. And so going forward, assimilation, boarding school, and then today it's so-called self-determination. So we are technically quasi-sovereign nations, which means we're not sovereign. We're not 100% sovereign. We are recognized by the federal government, but we don't have our rights we call ourselves nations. But the reality is we're still subject to federal policy. We use U.S. dollars. And so right now, this colonialism, this ongoing process of oppression and control, it, to me, really started with that doctrine of discovery. And then the 1872 mining law was, again, a policy to take our lands, using mining as a tool for legalized theft by extracting hard rock minerals such as gold, copper, silver, molybdenum, vanadium, uranium. And so today, that 1872 mining law is used on U.S. public lands, and it's as it was in 1872 that anyone can stake a claim in public land, and if they can prove they can mine these minerals, they only have to pay a fee of less than $10 a year, which was probably a lot in 1872, but they don't have to pay royalties. And so a lot of our fights today, Oak Flat, anything around the Grand Canyon, right now new mining is proposed on Mount Taylor, a lot of these were pushed by 1872 mining law, which was by design to expand the United States, to, forward manifest destiny, etc.
So, is there right now any mining happening in Navajo Nation within its borders?
Right now, that's a good question, or let me say, that's a loaded question. So, what are the borders of the Navajo Nation? We have the Navajo Nation or the reservation proper, but then we also have what's called Navajo Indian Country. And so those are legal definitions about the land and, the different rights and things like that. But as Diné people, we believe and we maintain, and a lot of people still live and work to protect all of the places within the Four Sacred Mountains, none of which are on the reservation. So that's the traditional boundary of our homelands is the Four Sacred Mountains, are the Four Sacred Mountains. So right now we're dealing with a lot of external forces trying to mine wherever they can. But when we talk about the Navajo Nation and uranium mining, since 2005, there's been a law to say no uranium mining. We had a law since 2012 to say no uranium transport, but that recently changed because of the hauling of uranium from Pinyon Plain to White Mesa Mill. So right now, I mean, the simple answer is no. No, we don't have uranium mining on the reservation. But a few years ago, there was a court case regarding a uranium mine in the checkerboard area. So the checkerboard area in eastern Navajo, and there's checkerboard all over the country. Checkerboard was created by the General Allotment Act, or the Dawes Act, and what that did was separate individual parcels of land and give them to individual heads of families. So that was probably the beginning of individual land ownership by Diné people, because we never owned the land. And so right now, the reservation is held in trust, and it's communally held. So nobody owns the land.
So can you explain that process to be a bit more about communally held land and federal trust? What is that? Explain that system to me.
Well, I mean, I think you should ask a lawyer to talk about these things. It can be very complicated. So through the General Allotment Act, and this was in the 1880s, I always forget the date, it was the mid-1880s, and what happened was, it's basically a divide and conquer tactic. Okay, so I think it would be good to ask a lawyer or somebody who works like at the land office, because the jurisdiction and the land rights or mineral rights or water rights can be pretty complicated. So depending, like in the Eastern Agency, I mentioned checkerboard. For allottees, back whenever they were first given, they were given this land by the federal government. It was an actual, section of land. And whenever this head of household died, it was divided amongst his heirs. And then every time someone died, it was further divided. So now these pieces of land are like super fractionated. And the people who own them don't technically own the land. They own the interest of the land. So that means they have the right to lease for oil and gas or uranium mining or anything. And that's the surface and subsurface rights. So there's a lot of areas around the res where it could be Navajo Nation, which is, as I was saying, like communally held, and nobody owns the land when it's the Navajo Nation as a whole. If there was mining or some activity, the tribe would get the royalties. The tribe would benefit, and then the money goes to, we just refer to it as Winderock. The tribe would go to the central government, which is a colonial structure modeled after the federal government. So we have 3 branches of government: a president, legislative branch, and then the judicial. But when things happen on the reservation, there's some processes that, depending who's in office, how it goes, it just really depends on the politics of the time. But essentially, as Diné, we all have a right to use our land. So we access pieces of land for, like, say we want a house, we would apply for a home site lease. And then that's good for like 65 years. And so it's basically ours to use, and, however we situate ourselves on that land, it's really not, people are mostly not disturbed. Like, we have people living out in the middle of nowhere, and there's a lot of houses that are off the grid. People still live without electricity and, running water. A lot of these houses sometimes were built before they even had a home site lease. And so now people are supposed to get the home site lease. This is kind of new stuff, because as traditional people, we were, how people call it, we were, I know the term nomadic is used, sometimes, but we were not nomadic. We weren't wandering around the desert. We had seasonal homes. So we had a winter home and a summer home. A lot of people, it depended on their sheep or whatever animals they had, so they wouldn't overgraze. And then also, of course, because of the weather. So it's very common that people have today still their winter home and their summer home. And so that's, kind of more of a traditional sense where people lived out in just wherever out on the land. Today, Indian Health Services is a federal entity that by law has to provide resources for sanitation for healthcare. So some houses are getting running water. Those are some houses that are out in the middle of nowhere. They might call them scattered homes. But later, I don't know when this occurred, I think in the late 20th century, probably from the 60s this way, the government started implementing a style of HUD housing, like some foreign type of community structure where there's, like a neighborhood with a street and a bunch of houses next to each other. That's not normal. We didn't live bunched up like that. People lived, with their families in family clusters, but traditionally we didn't have those types of neighborhoods. So all of this was really imposed on us through processes of colonialism. And today, I don't know how many land statuses there are. There's Navajo ranch land, Navajo fee land, there's BIA, BLM, U.S. Forest Service, all kinds of land statuses where state and private, of course, and in some of these places, it might be a split estate. So the surface is owned or governed by some entity, and then the subsurface rights, mineral rights, water rights, might be owned by another entity who, in this day, want to lease, any type of profitable minerals or whatever. And then, of course, everybody's after water. Everybody needs water. So a lot of these industries that have accessed lands within the Four Sacred Mountains, let's say churches, besides extractive industry, there was, the school system, boarding schools, the church. So all of these entities, they took a lot of land and they still own it today.
None of it's simple, though.
It's not simple at all. That's why I suggest you do talk to an expert, and I don't feel like an expert on land status, land jurisdiction.
I think you gave a pretty good idea, though, of kind of the nature of how it affects different parts of the community, especially places we've been. So actually, I really appreciate what you talked about.
Right.
Especially for some of those more traditional communities that don't have water or electricity and kind of live where they've built their homes, and it doesn't really make sense to the borders around them. So how does then, of course, that lead us till today, where now we have transporting from Grand Canyon to the mill? How does that how does that mine come about near the Grand Canyon? How does this route get established? And what's the conflict going on there today about it?
Well, so speaking about the Pinyon Plain mine specifically, and then the White Mesa Mill, both of those are off of Navajo. So on the Navajo Nation, we have a law saying no uranium mining. But when we say Navajo Nation, it's complicated because there's a lot of places that are not technically under our jurisdiction. And some of these things, some of these places were signed away in the 1868 treaty. So rights of way, places where utilities can go through. So a long time ago, our leaders signed away a lot of rights unknowingly, and that document was, future-proofed. The people who wrote it, again, all by design, knew how to make a legal document. For us, it was in a foreign language, in a foreign process where there was no free, prior, informed consent. But essentially, we're still subject to all of those things. And so, traditionally, there's families that live near, let's say, a a rock formation or some structure or maybe some water. And their family has always lived there. Their clans are kind of based, in that. So, our clan system, that's one of the most traditional aspects of Navajo governance, I would say, if there was. It's not governance, but today we call, it's still used today. So all of us have clans, and it's what we call our S system. So our family structure, it's not a like blood relationship, but it's how we all relate to each other. So like for myself, I didn't even introduce myself. I'm a, we usually do this whenever especially before public speaking. Mm-hmm. And it's to identify our relationships with each other, but it's also, to identify ourselves to the, where the land, the location, whatever is there. So like for myself, I would say, Twodich Nishla, Tanabili Kiani Dashe, Twoglini Dashanella. So that would kind of denote where you're from traditionally and kind of your responsibilities there as to, taking care of the land or whatever your family has done for, since time immemorial. But today, people were moved around. There was the long walk. We were, they tried to force us to move to Oklahoma. That didn't work. The United States failed. They failed to eradicate us, and they failed to remove us from our land. So when we returned to the Four Sacred Mountains, and not everybody was removed. There was a lot of people who stayed, and they hid, and they were able to, stay where they're at. So I think, a lot of the history you can read about, but I think it's kind of funny. People in Western Navajo, I've heard jokes, about how Eastern Navajo is more assimilated. So my people were from Eastern Navajo. So the Navajo Nation is divided into 5 agencies, which was created by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so all of these locations and how we're structured today, it's really interesting that we still follow a lot of this, like the colonial divide and conquer stuff. So right now, just so you know, there's a lot of places on the reservation, within the reservation, even though, we have this somewhat contiguous landmass, there's a few islands. Alamo is off the res, but it's Navajo reservation, and then you have Twahajile just east of here. And then we have the Hopi Nation right inside of Navajo, and then inside the Hopi Nation, we have Jedito, another island. So it's not all just one landmass. And then within that, there's a lot of places that are privately owned from hundreds of years ago. And I mentioned the checkerboard area. So even though you can look at a map and you see this huge landmass, basically wherever there's a federal highway or state highway, we don't have jurisdiction over those areas. So we don't have jurisdiction over the roads, the railroads, airspace. A lot of that is dictated by federal policy, such as interstate commerce. So we can't stop certain goods from going from point A to point B.
So that kind of catches us up to this point. So what's the conflict that's currently happening? What are some of even the actions taken that have kind of helped escalate this? What's happening that's upsetting you as a movement right now?
Well, thank you. Thanks for that question. So there's quite a long history, because we're talking about one mine, and you were asking, when did mining start on the reservation? So since the 40s, there's been hundreds of places where mining has occurred, probably thousands of places where exploratory drilling has occurred. And so the reservation is just perforated, by the uranium and nuclear industry. And a lot of that, all of that, anything before 1970 was before the National Environmental Policy Act was passed, which created the EPA, which later passed things like the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Air Act. So all of that mining was done before there were policies in place to protect the environment. And so that's the nation as a whole. So they say, the US EPA says 523 abandoned uranium mines and 4 mills, uranium mills. But if you look at the entire, if you look at the entire area between the 4 sacred mountains, there's way more mines and way more mills. So all of that contamination, it's underground, it's in the groundwater, it's blowing around, and also way later, we can't forget about all of the nuclear testing in Nevada. So I'm just kind of painting a picture that there's a lot of mining, and before, most of it was done for World War II and the Cold War to make weapons. So anything before 1971, the U.S. government claims as mining, they're mining, I guess, for defense purposes, which is why the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, that's another long story because that is something in the news today too. But people who mined before 1971 are not eligible for RECA because the federal government says, oh, that's not our responsibility. Because they claim after the 70s it was for commercial use in nuclear power plants. So there's also a division of time when we're talking about these issues. So all over the res, all over within the 4 sacred mountains, all over the Four Corners area, lots of mining, all different kinds of industry, lots of contamination, lots of health problems, sickness today. So again, I'm going to go back to the mine, but it's only one mine that you're asking about.
Right. So you kind of set up that question perfectly. So what is the uranium at Pinon being used for, and why does it have to take the route it's taking?
So the Pinon Plain Mine was originally called the Canyon Mine, and they started to apply for their license back in the 80s. I think their scoping period under NEPA started in 84, and then they were given the permit in 86. So there's a lot of people who have been fighting the mine since the mid-80s. The number one nation or number one opposition are the Havasupai. So the Havasupai tribe lives down, their traditional homelands is down in the canyon. And they also have sacred places, not just the canyon itself, but there's a place called Red Butte. And so this is not my homeland, but anyone who knows about Canyon Mine, Pinon Plain, if they know the history, they would know that this is sacred land, that there's people that have been fighting it for a long time, and their fight, unfortunately, they went through different lawsuits and all kinds of different strategies that essentially didn't work to stop the mine. The most recent was the formation of a national monument, which was successful in stopping future mines, but even that had loopholes. So what happened was in the 80s, Canyon Mine was licensed, and it takes a long time to build a mine, especially, an underground mine, depending. And I'm not a geologist, I'm not a engineer, or, I'm not a miner. So to dig a shaft and to, how far down it goes, eventually you're going to hit water and you have to pump out the water, especially if people are going to go down there. Because there's other mines. There's mines that go laterally into a rock or mountaintop removal. So there's all kinds of, that's conventional mining. And then there's also ISL mining, which is a whole different process. Today we're just talking about conventional mining, where you get the rock and then you take it out of the mine and then you take it to a mill. So that to make yellow cake. So that is conventional mining. So the Pinon Plain Mine, they had a lot of challenges over the years, and for the just in general, mining was very prevalent between the 1950s to the 80s. And so it was like a huge boom of uranium all across the West, what we call the Intermountain West region. So not just in the Four Corners, but, up in Wyoming and up that way. And then Texas is probably not really included in that, but South Texas also had a lot of mining. So if you look on a map, it's, right in the middle. And there's not a lot of water in our area. And so there's not a lot of nuclear power plants. Most of the nuclear power plants are on the coasts and, where there's big rivers and bodies of water. So Canyon Mine, I would imagine, just wasn't able to rely on any kind of profit once the market went down in the 80s. So a lot of mining stopped in the 80s. Like here in New Mexico, I think like 1981, the early 80s was when the last uranium mines were really operating. And then there was like a period of no mining.
So what keeps this one going?
Well, the price of uranium is always going up and down. In 2007, the price of uranium, it skyrocketed. The federal government and the different nuclear interests, like the industry, the lobbyists, different companies, I would say, the World Nuclear Association, the International Atomic Energy Agency, all these entities were predicting that there was going to be this thing called a nuclear renaissance. But it was basically their own propaganda. Like it was this thing they created saying, oh, we're going to build all these nuclear power plants, and all these power plants are going to necessitate new uranium fuel. And so, the industry got really excited, and the price of uranium went over $130 a pound. It almost hit $140 in 2007, and that was the last time the price of uranium was that high until last January. So in January last year, the price of uranium went over $100 a pound, and that's what happened again. All these companies got excited for new mining, but I keep telling people, it's not a supply and demand economy. Like, let's say we saw the price of eggs go up, when all the birds got sick and there was a shortage of eggs. So the price of eggs went really high because, there was what do you call it?
There was a shortage of eggs.
Well, yeah, there's an actual commodity. You have the actual eggs, and then they were not there. With uranium, they speculate. They're counting their eggs before they hatch. That worked out pretty well. So the uranium is in the ground. So they estimate, we have this much uranium at our mine. So we have the potential to mine this much. And we're going to, it's this amount of ore grade, and we're going to take out this many tons, and we're going to make, such and such a profit. So companies, uranium mining companies, are always telling their investors, how rich they're going to get and how much mining they're going to do because the uranium is needed. But the reality is, for a long time, the United States was buying nuclear weapons from Russia and downblending them. So they were weapons. The uranium was what they call weapons grade. So they enrich it to over 20%, to a higher level of enrichment. But for energy, you need a much lower amount, I think between 5 and 12, or, somewhere way below 20%. Yeah, exactly. So they bought all these nuclear weapons from Russia, diluted them, and that's what we've been using for a long time. So last March, Biden made it illegal to buy Russian uranium. And then just 6 months or a few months before then, in November 2023, Biden announced at the United Nations COP meeting that the United States is going to triple nuclear development by 2050 because it's clean energy. It's, carbon neutral or carbon free or whatever. And that's because they only count the carbon at the nuclear power plant. They don't count any of the fossil fuels used before the nuclear power plant, so all the mining, the enrichment, fuel fabrication, and they don't count anything after, which is going to be radioactive for forever, or the transport. So they created this whole thing that they are saying, oh, we're going to have this, again, a nuclear revival. But it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It's
But
really good sell is what it is.
it's a good, they're very good salesmen
Well,
to themselves.
all right.
We don't buy it.
No. Well, then that's kind of the so for someone who just doesn't even get what the route looks like, what is the route you're even talking about? From where does it start, where does it go, and then where does that end at the mill?
Okay, so talking about Canyon Mine, they got really close to starting. Just to kind of go back into history. Wait, excuse me.
Bless you.
Yeah, it's not a. It wasn't a hiccup,
Almost
but
bless
thank you. Let me start again.
And like kind of starting by the volcano, and like kind of just describing the route itself.
Yeah, so like I was saying before, Pinyon Plain, like all the other mines, it was on its way. Probably it thought, Energy Fuels probably thought they were going to, profit whenever they finished building the mine, and they thought back in like the 2000s that they were going to complete the mine, and that they would start, or they say pretty much every mining company says, oh, we're going to start next year, in 2011 Fukushima happened, and that kind of really messed up that whole nuclear renaissance that was trying to build themselves up in 2007. So moving forward, Obama signed what's called a uranium moratorium that stopped mining on 1 million acres around the Grand Canyon for 20 years. So that kind of slowed things down. But what happened this entire time, the mine, like a lot of mines, they, especially if they're already, they have the shaft, they're digging the shaft, they have infrastructure in place, they want to maintain their permit. So by law, some of these places shouldn't be mining. If they're not extracting, they're supposed to close, and what they do is they go on standby. And that, kind of just hits pause on their application, their permits, and they can just hang out and not clean up. So they keep thinking, oh, we're going to start mining next year, we're going to start mining. But it's really dependent on, can they actually mine? Do they have, is their mine complete? Do they have the means to mine, meaning like financial backing? So all those things have to be in place. And so Pinyon Plain got its license in 1986, but the mine was actually not complete until 2023. So our organization started, sometimes I call it an organization, but it's more or less a campaign. Like we do autonomous organizing, we do community organizing, and I would say we're more or less a group of activists and community organizers. We're all volunteers, none of us are paid to do this work. And we started in 2016. My interest was knowing Energy Fuels has a mine on Mount Taylor, and their mill is in the Four Corners area. So White Mesa Mill is in just south of Blanding, Utah. So in order to get from Mount Taylor, they're going to have to go through the res. And they can't because of our no transport law. So I thought, back then I was a lot younger, and I didn't know about interstate commerce. I didn't know about the right of way and all of this. But one of the things when I learned about nuclear transports, and this also applies to things like Holtec and the push for consolidated interim storage of high-level radioactive waste in New Mexico and Texas. So we really can't stop a lot of transports, but we can stop the facilities. So if we stop the facility, then we can stop the transport. So trying to stop Roca Honda Mine on Mount Taylor, I figured, back then, this was like in 2009, I knew if Roca Honda ever started, it would be going through my people's community, and then who knows what would happen all along the route. But I didn't know Energy Fuels had a mine at the Grand Canyon that was already, being built and would probably start mining before Roca Honda. Roca Honda is not even built. So Energy Fuels owns both the companies. Energy Fuels owns both of the mines, Roca Honda and Pinyon Plain, and the mill. So in 2016, a few of us, we were at a conference talking about both of these situations, that no matter which one started, they're both going to the same place. So Pinyon Plain from the west, and then Roca Honda from the east. And it was three of us sitting around the table, and my colleague Clee Benali, he grew up near Pinyon Plain. He grew up in northern Arizona. His family, his mom and his whole family, really his mom did a lot of anti-nuke work back in the day, and he had been monitoring the mine for a long time. I don't know how long. So when we met and we got together, it was the same issue primarily, that we have these two threats and it's going to hurt our people if the mining starts. So when we talked about the transport, understanding that that the Navajo Nation doesn't really have jurisdiction, we started this group, we started this campaign. Now some people call it a movement, which is Haul No. And he was very clever. He's the one that came up with the name. So Haul No started in 2016. He was already monitoring the mine way before. So you can find videos of him talking about it. There's a Democracy Now! Episode from 2012 where he's talking about the mine. And not much has changed except that it has now started. So Clee and I had been working together very closely, and he was monitoring the mine with a drone. And we knew every time Energy Fuels said, "Oh, we're going to start next year," that it was a lie, because we knew from his video footage, our observation was they still needed to build what's called a vent shaft. And so in April 2023, he called me and said, "It's done. They're going to start they're going to start soon. We need to get ready." So even though they had their license in 1986, the mine wasn't complete until early 2023. And then they started mining probably in December. They announced to their stockholders and investors that they were mining in December 2023. But that first pile of uranium didn't come out of the ground until January 8th, 2024. So they started mining despite all the opposition and other barriers like the moratorium and the monument, which had loopholes to allow the mining. And now today, they are actively mining and transporting. So the route goes from it's south of the Grand Canyon, just a little ways, about I think as the crow flies, less than 15 miles from the Colorado River. The mine, if you just drew a straight line, they are mining near a sacred place called Red Butte, and it's on U.S. Forest Service lands. And their route goes from that U.S. Forest Service lands it's like mostly like dirt road, and then you get to the paved highway, which goes north and south between Tucson and Williams, Arizona. So they take that road, they go south to I-40, and then east to Flagstaff, and then in Flagstaff, they get off I-40, and then they use 89, which goes through the Navajo Reservation. And then there's another highway, I think 160, and then like 191. I forget the names of all the highways. So, but the route essentially goes from the mine to Williams to Flagstaff, and then through the first community would be Gray Mountain on the res, and then Cameron, and then Tuba City, and then Kienta, and up around close to the Four Corners, it turns to Utah around Mexican Water, and then Bluff, and then White Mesa. And then that's where it ends. So it's over 300 miles long and goes through several indigenous homelands. When you say homelands, there's a lot of indigenous people in between the mine and the mill, but the various reservations it actually goes through is, there's Havasupai homelands, but it doesn't go through that much reservation land until it hits the Navajo reservation, and then it kind of hugs the Hopi Nation, and then we get into Utah, which is Ute lands. So there's different indigenous nations, but the Navajo Nation is the only one that has a law against mining and a law against transport. And so they started transport in July 2024. And our organization, we had been using, I'll just start again. Our campaign, we've been using social media to spread awareness, to let people know what's going on, because a lot of people had no idea that this exists. Mm-hmm. And because we have a law against mining, people just assume there's no mining. It's like, well, no, there's mining off the res. So this is off the reservation. Obviously, it's really far off the reservation. But when the mining started, a lot of Diné people were confused because they figured, oh, we have a law that says no mining and no transport. So they were wondering, how could this happen? So since 2016, we've been educating people about all of these loopholes, all of the reality, and even calling it an imminent threat. Because knowing when it starts, if it ever started, we are going to be in the middle.
And that's kind of even my last question. So what is the threat? What is the danger of uranium mining? What is the Diné, Ute, and Havasupai community risking with this in their backyard?
Well, essentially, with all the mining, and the industry will say, oh, well, the old stuff it was unregulated. Today, it is totally safe. But anybody who lives near a uranium site knows there's contamination. And there's so many stories about, this truck spilled uranium here, there was this accident here, this train derailment. So there's a lot of places where uranium has spilled, and lots of traffic, different transport accidents. Like even in my family, my mom talks about a story where a big uranium truck just fell over. I don't know what happened, but the entire truck, the big uranium truck, crushed a pickup that had 3 people in it. And those were my relatives. And so they just, they were instantly killed. So there were tons of accidents, deaths, different things that occurred. And again, the companies today say, well, that's before we had laws in place. That's before regulations. Now we're safe. Now everything is, contained and blah, blah, blah. With this particular company proposal, they are permitted to transport up to 12 trucks a day, which is each truck carries about 25 tons of uranium. And so their license allows them to transport that much every day. With our outreach and education, we caused a lot of people to raise their voices to the Navajo Nation to demand that the Navajo Nation stop the transport. And so last year, when the transport started, the Navajo Nation president made a big show. He had this huge action. I wouldn't even call it that. The Navajo Nation president last year did this big show. He had this parade. He had an event in Cameron. So Cameron is one of the first communities the transport goes through. And I mentioned over 500 abandoned mines on the res. Cameron alone has 111 abandoned mines. So nearly a quarter of all the abandoned mines are in Cameron. So Boone Nygren had this big circus last year after the transport started. his wife, himself, and others gathered to say they're going to stop the mining. I mean, they're going to stop the transport. And so they were successful. He was successful in getting the governor of Arizona to pause the transport. So Governor Hobbs of Arizona had the transport stopped for 6 months pending negotiations between the tribe and Energy Fuels. And so that's because everybody is saying, you know, this is too dangerous and the trucks are only going to be covered with tarps. And, you know, people were concerned, people were scared, and it wasn't just for themselves. A lot of people knew, you know, there's possible exposures, you know, the trucks can, you know, probably spill and get uranium, you know, on the surface, you know, things like that. But it's more so for not just for us today, but the future generations, you know, what they're going to have to deal with once that uranium blows around or probably settles and could get, you know, when it rains and the environment will naturally move it. So for us, it's not just the contamination of the environment, it's the contamination of the sacred places, but a lot of it has to do with human health. So we've been dealing with lots of cancers, reproductive issues, basically all of these things that are still unknown that are caused by the nuclear industry. So some of the stuff people are worried and scared about, a lot of people, you know, it's also the unknown. You know, we don't have, you know, clear studies, and the World Health Organization, you know, it's highly unlikely the World Health Organization will ever say the nuclear industry causes all these cancers. But it's proven through, you know, different studies, and it's even documented in the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, all of the impacts like thyroid disease, pulmonary fibrosis, a lot of illnesses that exist that people have, not just deaf people. So the risk, it's mostly the accidents that could occur, because if they're going through the Navajo Nation, ideally they're, you know, people assume these trucks aren't going to stop, they're not going to take shortcuts, because the approved route is that route. There's only one route. They had an alternative route that goes through private land, but the private landowners never gave consent. So I'm really glad they didn't. And so that's a good thing. But now Energy Fuels has mines north of the canyon, and I'm not sure what the routes are for that. I think it's north. But with Roca Honda, again, we're not 100% clear what is the route. So this one was very clear what the route was. And so we took a lot of time. In 2017, Hall No did a tour where we did events, presentations, and direct action training at a lot of communities on the res. We did White Mesa with the Ute Mountain Ute community. We did one in Bluff, Monument Valley, Kayenta, Tuba City, Cameron, Flagstaff, and then we ended at Red Butte. So we did all these actions. We did, well, educational talks, we did gatherings, we did the trainings, and that, I think, was very successful because, again, Clee Benally, he was very media savvy and was able to get a lot of social media out there. He made this amazing website. Like, I can't take credit for the website or like the really cool graphics. And so people were very, you know, people really like his tone of resistance. It was something for young people to gravitate toward. But I think when the mining actually started, he had just passed away 10 days before that. And so we were left, I mean, I was actively working with him. And so, you know, we didn't even have time to grieve. Immediately, you know, we went into action. So there was a volunteer who took pictures of the uranium that had been extracted. And I had that picture on my phone. And I ran that picture to people in the Navajo Nation to show them, hey, the mining started. We have to stop this. And the company was supposed to notify the tribe, was supposed to notify the Forest Service, and the Forest Service was supposed to notify all the tribes. That didn't happen. They didn't notify anyone. So when the transport started, the president of the Navajo Nation got the governor of Arizona to pause it, and everybody thought, good. Everybody was happy. 6 months went by, and then there was this announcement that the transport was going to restart, which happened this February 2025. And with that announcement, we found out that the Navajo Nation actually went into business with the company. So I had a feeling something was not right. Like in August last year, August 26th, the council voted to amend the transportation law. So the law that says no transport, they changed it to say the Navajo Nation is going to regulate transport. So they wanted to put all these hindrances on the company, impose fees, have checkpoints, a curfew, and then they realized, oh, we don't have regulations for any kind of transport. So they gave themselves a year to come up with regulations for all kinds of hazmat transport. So hopefully in August they will have that done, and we'll see what the tribe comes up with. But the idea was to make it as limiting as possible and expensive, to, insist that all of these companies traveling through Navajo have a special license, have to stop at these checkpoints where for the uranium they get a radiation scan, they're supposed to be like a weigh station. So none of this exists. So the idea is when the companies pay this license fee, it'll build this pot of money that will somehow pay for all the infrastructure and personnel needed to have all these checkpoints at all the major thoroughfares through the res, which would also include Roca Honda, and then other industry. So August 26th last year, we lost our transport law. And so now the tribe is saying they're going to regulate. So what that means in terms of Pinyon Plain, the company can only go through the reservation between 8:30 and 3 o'clock. So that's when kids are in school. So the idea is, the most vulnerable are protected. They're supposed to be in school. But if you ever drive that haul route, it's a mostly two-lane highway through the res, and it's very, it's very bad. The road conditions are very bad normally. So I think, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, we never had the jurisdiction to begin with, so for the Navajo Nation to impose some kind of qualifications that the company has to get this radiation scan and can only transport, so many hours a day, that sounds great. We have a little bit of protections in place, but what came out of it was this agreement also allows the company to go from Roca Honda to the mill. And then it also includes transport of up to 40,000 tons of uranium in the name of cleanup. So the tribe is saying, oh, they're going to clean up, they're going to help us, they're going to take all this waste off the nation for free. But that goes into some other political stuff dealing with how the United States is imposing cleanup on our nation using a process called ablation. So they're saying, oh, we can separate the waste and take the most radioactive waste away, like 90% of the most dangerous stuff. So whatever's left is really not that bad because, it's already radioactive. Your land is already high because it already has a high background because there's naturally occurring uranium. So the idea is like they're going to take away this waste, but really my question is, okay, so if that's more radioactive stuff, are they going to take it to the mill and reprocess it and profit off of it? And then who's going to get that money? Is it going to go to the tribe? Is it going to go to Energy Fuels? And at the same time, now we're in an era of national security. Uranium is called a critical mineral. Now Trump is pushing for, he's fast tracking all these mines, deregulating everything, and the NRC is one of those entities that's, losing its so-called independence. I mean, the NRC is essentially a cheerleader for the nuclear industry, but even that is getting gutted. And so I hear they're also trying to lax, different regulations like what is the allowable dose to human workers, which that law itself is also racist. It's based on we call it reference man. So the law allows a certain amount of radiation to be dosed to a nuclear worker who is a mid-30s man from a Western European country that weighs so many pounds and is so high. So it's really specific to this white man. And so when you take that same dose and you expose a woman who we have more fatty tissue in our bodies, we're going to be absorbing more radiation than reference man. And then if you compare it to a child or a baby or a fetus, it is way higher, the dose that is allowable. So if they're going to increase that, ultimately, it's not just going to affect the nuclear worker, it's going to affect everybody. So this is what's happening today is a lot of, we're watching people, U.S. citizens being deported. And so when Hall Nose started, CLE was really pushing for people to put their bodies in front of the machinery, stop those trucks by any means possible. We were training people on how to do lockdowns, how to blockade the road and, the different tools and things to do that. I was always in the camp of, you have fun. I'll be there with the bail money. And so I don't think that's today even something to talk about without being targeted and, having some serious consequences if anybody tried to stop a uranium mine or uranium transport, because then they're standing in the way of national security, so we might, they could just easily be disappeared by the federal government. So, all of these things, the nuclear industry is inherently racist and sexist, and dealing, combined with the politics of today, it's a really scary time. And so we're still fighting this, and uranium is just one thing. It's like I said, this is just one mine. There's several other facilities all over the place. Not, we're talking about both nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. And so the lie that nuclear energy is clean or safe really does not include any of the human health impacts, human rights, or environmental rights, nothing. So it's basically the industry, again, doing this propaganda, making this international lie, because this is at the UN level. It's not just the United States. So it's the United Nations and the International Atomic Energy Agency that calculates the carbon output. And so all of these things basically, in New Mexico, we have 2 national labs. We have the only enrichment facility in North America. Well, one of the, yeah. So this is something that we're dealing with on a massive scale. And then, we haven't even talked about the waste. So on Navajo Nation, we're dealing with cleanup, very bad cleanup proposals, and there's really nowhere to put the waste from nuclear energy. In New Mexico, we also have WIPP. So that's a weapons waste facility. And the proposal for an energy waste facility is only 14 miles north of WIPP as the crow flies. There's 2 proposals. One is in New Mexico, one is in Texas. And I worked with a group of lots of people across the country to stop both of them. And we were successful. We were able to get a New Mexico state law, a Texas state law. And then we also took it to court. And we did win our first few rounds of, it kind of goes back and forth. And the last the last round of court cases was in our favor. But the most recent was a Supreme Court decision that came out yesterday, which was that, and it doesn't really stipulate whether the permits or the licenses are valid, but it's more about who has the right to sue. So essentially, depending what newspaper you look at, some say, oh, the federal government is pushing for the waste dumping in New Mexico and Texas. And then some others say, oh, just Texas. The court case was only a Texas.
But they said you basically don't have the right to sue them over it. It has nothing to say about it almost. So they like to tie your hands that way, don't they?
There's a lot of interesting ways the law works and industry, and essentially I have come to learn that human rights, all of these things that we fight for, indigenous rights, all of it for the protection of our people, our children, our future generations, it means nothing. And the laws that exist are not there to protect us. They're there to protect the United States. It's, all of the holdings that it stole from us, and to protect industry. So, I just saw this funny quote somewhere that said, HR is not there to protect the worker, it's there to protect the company. So essentially, especially in this Trump era, you can see everything that they're going after and everything that they're protecting for the sake of ongoing colonialism and capitalism. And to me, this is basically another uranium bubble. So in 2007, they created this hype. It never panned out. And so they're saying, oh yeah, we're going to have all these nuclear power plants. So today the hype is small modular nuclear reactors and high assay low enriched uranium. So all these new, so-called new technologies, it doesn't matter what they call it or who's funding it or anything. All of it relies on uranium. So to have nuclear weapons or to have nuclear energy, you need uranium. And what is happening now is they want more faster. And so this is what we're up against is, Trump, he greenlit a mine in Utah in 14 days. So I don't work on that one. And I know our friends in Utah are really scrambling. And unfortunately, Utah is very pro-nuclear. New Mexico is pretty pro-nuclear when it comes down to it. Our nuclear, but like the budget of Los Alamos is more than the entire state of New Mexico. And so people want to protect that. They think it's a good economy, But the reality is the damage that's happening and the damage to our genetics and, the integrity of our environment and our water, it's irreplaceable, it's irreversible. And we need to stop everything and start assessing the damage done and cleaning it up. I feel like we probably already, we already opened Pandora's box. But I believe we can stop it. I believe we can reverse some of it. It's going to take a lot of money and a lot of time. And that's why myself and others, we work on these things forever. It's not a campaign it's not like any type of campaign where you have a beginning and an end. It's an endless fight. And all we can do is set it up for the next generation to take over.